Hello, everyone, and welcome to Book Break. Today, my special guest is Mindy, who is an avid reader and also does a lot of our history and genealogy programs. March is National Women's Month, so Mindy and I have curated some titles featuring women as the main protagonist. So you majored in women's studies, actually, correct?
I did. I was a double major, history and women's studies, minored in anthropology.
Okay, because you were like well versed on this topic.
Yes.
This is like your shining star. Yeah.
Love it.
Okay. So I think are all of yours nonfiction today?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
I did read fiction this past month, but I'm not going to talk about the trashy paranormal romances I read. So
Why not?
That's okay. You know, every now and then we do that. But yeah, I actually have one historical fiction featuring a set of sisters in the French Revolution. And then I did 2 nonfiction as well. But mine are more contemporary memoirs, so it'll be a little bit different, but all about women. This is women's stories for March.
Nice. We'll have a nice panoramic view of women's history.
Yeah, something hopefully for everybody. So I'm going to start with my first one, and this is one that I believed Megan, one of our coworkers, talked about in her preview for 2025. It's called The Woman in the Wallpaper by Laura Jones. And when I saw it was historical and based around the time of the French Revolution, I was like, I think I'm going to give this one a try. It was a big chonkaroo. It's almost 500 pages, but let me tell you something. I could barely put this book down.
Really?
I got very invested in these characters. So it is written from the point of view of 3 women whose lives collide dramatically during the French Revolution. So we have Sophie. She's a wallpaper factory worker. Her sister Laura is also in the same location, but she's a lady's maid in the house of the wallpaper factory owner, and a young aristocrat named Hortense, who is actually married kind of like the heir to the wallpaper throne. She was a young aristocratic woman at Versailles who was such a pain. She didn't approve of any of her parents' choices for arranged marriages in Versailles, so her father fixed her and was like, okay, well, I'll marry you off to a merchant and you'll be gone. So,
Was he a rich merchant?
yes, he's a pretty wealthy merchant, but he is not the Sun King rich, if you know what I mean. You know, it was a very different life for Hortense, and she was not pleased.
Oh, wow. He actually followed through on the threat.
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, when they get to this wallpaper factory, what they've noticed is that in many of the designs, there's a woman that is portrayed in these little vignettes of, you know, like picnics or doing things with her son and flying a kite. And the odd thing is one of the 2 sisters, Laura, who is the housemaid, looks eerily like this woman in the wallpaper. So Joseph, who is married to Hortense, actually loved Laura and wanted to marry her, but the father wanted some cash and also some notoriety injected into the factory and wanted this society connection. Wow. So you have all these people with different agendas, and also you have the backdrop of the French Revolution, and the other sister, Sophie, is getting very involved in that cause. So she's going to Paris. I believe she watches an execution and starts going to meetings and stuff. And it was interesting because a lot of the meetings were women's groups that were formed to try to get women's rights going, because a lot of women worked in these factories and didn't have rights. They had no way to make their voices heard. So that was kind of interesting to me. So you have a mystery that starts to occur because the one sister that looks like the woman in the wallpaper starts to have visions almost and kind of sees herself living out some of the scenes in the wallpaper. And she's not sure if she's going crazy or if the son that is married to someone else is actually trying to like push her into this role. So It was really interesting. It kind of explored a lot of sisterly love. It also had some family secrets in there. You know, what's not to love about a good family secret? So you have the factory heir, Joseph Oberst. What's his story? Like, what is really going on with this wallpaper? And different other characters. And of course, the backdrop of the French Revolution was really interesting, and I thought really well done. So
Was she having visions because they were using like mercury or arsenic to make the wallpaper, or did they go into that at all? Or
No, they didn't go into that. But yeah,
Okay.
some of the chemicals and the dyes and stuff they used, I mean,
Yeah.
these people were getting sick from this.
As soon as you said visions, I was like, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was more almost like a little bit of a paranormal angle.
Okay.
Not
okay.
too overdone, but definitely a little bit of,
So definitely not like a Mad Hatter syndrome type thing.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no.
So
All right.
I don't want to give too much of the story away, but I did find it really interesting. And even though it was a long book, I felt like I finished it pretty quickly and definitely read pretty quickly. So I feel like if you like historical, especially historical mystery with a little bit of that kind of magic thrown in, I definitely feel like this would be a book for you.
I'm going to add that to my to be read pile.
Yeah.
For sure. Because it's hard to find a good historical fiction about the French Revolution that doesn't just focus on Marie Antoinette.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
She's briefly mentioned, but yeah, definitely this focuses on these people and
Interesting.
what's going around. Like you hear about what happens to Marie Antoinette and some of the other people,
Yeah,
but
spoiler alert.
yeah, spoiler alert, we all know, but
Yeah.
yeah, I thought it was good. And then the author at the end, which I always appreciate in a historical novel, talked about like what was true, what she
good.
based. Like this actually was based on a real wallpaper factory. Of course, this is not the story of that wallpaper factory, but so she gives you like what's true, what's not true. And I always appreciate a good author's note.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. No, I like to see the research that goes into it too. Because, they do a lot of work
oh yeah, yeah,
to get into it. And
yeah. So what's your first one, Mindy?
Oh, sure. So I'm going to shift my paper around so I can still make eye contact. All right. So I'm going to talk about 3 nonfiction books about French and royal women, and there's a lot to unpack in all 3 of these, so I took very detailed notes. But I'm going to stay in my order. I organized them chronologically.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with the first one, Young Queens, 3 Renaissance Women and the Price of Power by Leah Redmond Chang, and it was published in 2023. So all 3 of these, sorry, I take that back. The first 2 I listened to as an audiobook. The narrator was fantastic.
Oh, okay.
And then the last one I read, and it took me weeks and weeks and weeks to read it. There was just so much information in there. But the Young Queens book was really interesting. I hadn't read something like this before. It's about 3 queens during the Renaissance period, and I had read about each of them, but never interwoven.
Okay.
So this was really interesting for me to see how the author did it. So she kind of interwove the lives of 3 Renaissance queens who all lived together at the French court for a time in the 1500s.
Okay.
And all 3 were born into wealth and privilege, and all 3 went through awful, tumultuous times, and all 3 ended up queens. So there's Catherine de' Medici as the oldest one of the trio. And then there's her daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, who is the oldest daughter of her and her husband, Henry II of France. And then Mary, Queen of Scots, who lived as a child at the French court and actually shared a room with Elizabeth of Valois growing up. And so they had a happy childhood. They were very pampered, very spoiled, and, they were just groomed to greatness. And Elizabeth of Valois was born in 1546, and she went on to marry Philip II of Spain after his first wife, Mary Tudor, died. And she was about 14 when she married Philip, and he was, I think, pushing 30.
Oh,
Yep.
nice.
So Elizabeth ended up dying in 1568 of a miscarriage from her 4th pregnancy. She did have 2 children that lived, and Philip spent a great deal of time and energy molding her into his ideal consort. And it was very rigid life at the Spanish court. Like, she couldn't even look out a window.
Oh,
It was so restrictive. And she went from, the French court with all the frivolity and the fanciness. It was before Versailles, but it was still, like the height of culture, to this very very repressive, weighted down, heavy atmosphere. But she succeeded as being a very popular Spanish queen. So Philip had a son with his first wife, Don Carlos, and he was actually almost Elizabeth's age, and there was rumors that they were actually going to be married. And Don Carlos kind of resented that Philip stole his bride.
Oh.
And Don Carlos was kind of addled, unbalanced, unstable. And at one point, he fell down a flight of stone steps and had a head injury. And after that, he was just like crazy. They ended up locking him up, and he died in also the same year that Elizabeth of Valois died. So he died insane and incarcerated. And Philip married again. He actually married his cousin, Anna of Austria, and she had a son who succeeded Philip as Philip III when he died in 1598. So you got the story of Elizabeth going, as queen in Spain, and meanwhile, back in France, we still have Catherine and Mary. And Mary, Queen of Scots, went on to marry Catherine de' Medici's oldest son, Francis. So she was Queen of France for a very brief period of time, about 2 years, before Francis got sick and died. Catherine didn't want to support Mary, Queen of Scots, at the French court. She was very expensive, but Mary did have a dowry. She had French property. She had a very powerful family, the Guise family. She could have stayed as Dowager Queen and made, she would have been set. But somehow, some way, they convinced her to go back to Scotland, where she was a crowned queen, and rule. And everything fell apart when she went back there. So her father was King James of Scotland, and he died when she was only a few days old. And rumor has it that as soon as he heard that his wife, Mary of Guise, gave birth to a daughter, he said, my dynasty started with the lass, and it will end with the lass. And it didn't. There was her son, James. But they were not happy that Mary of Guise's child was a daughter. So Mary of Guise went on to, after James died, she was regent of Scotland. Awful time. England kept invading. They wanted Mary, Queen of Scots, to marry the English heir, Edward, and they called it the rough wooing because there was a lot of invading, a lot of fighting, a lot of tension there. Mary of Guise sends Mary, Queen of Scots, across to France to be with her family, to be raised at the French court, and she's groomed to be the French queen consort, even though she's a crown queen in her own right. So that's all going on. Henry II raises her as if she is one of his own. She shares the best room with Elizabeth. They grow up like sisters. And then Elizabeth goes off and marries the Spanish king, and Mary marries her brother. He dies, and she goes back to Scotland. Catherine Medici stays put this entire time. So she's the leading figure in both of their lives, and there was a huge influence on the French court with Henry II's mistress, Diane of de Poitiers. But Catherine still, when Henry died, she was the Queen Dowager, the Queen Mother, and she was the ruling influence, and she had 10 children.
10 children?
She had 10 children.
Wow.
She outlived all but 3 of them.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. And several of them were sons, and each of them went on to reign. And there's a Salic law in France where only sons can inherit. And Catherine's sons all died without sons. So the throne actually went to her former son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV. And he's the one who was famous for saying Paris is worth a mass, because he converted to Catholicism in the 1590s when everybody was at war with Protestantism. There was a war of the religions.
Okay.
And to make things flow more smoothly during his reign, he converted to Catholicism.
I think that Salic law was in England, like Charlotte is the first one that's actually in line for the throne and not supplanted by another male.
It did, yeah.
So that's lasted a long time. Not that they're a ruling monarchy, but still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the male line inheriting in England, too.
Yeah.
Like, that's a very recent change. Yeah. So it was very, very interesting how these 3 women all ruled the countries that they were in and how they got along. And, they would write each other mother, sister, and keep those family bonds close. but, they did not have a happy life. I mean, Elizabeth died very, very young. She didn't really get to see her family a lot. Mary Queen of Scots went back to Scotland, and she got overthrown and imprisoned, and she got executed in the 1580s.
Good times.
Yeah, so it was not a fairy tale ending.
No.
Catherine de' Medici, I think, I would argue, had the most successful reign out of all of them. She was well respected, well loved. And she just was a mentor to her sons throughout all of their reigns. And then she died during her last son's reign.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that is the Young Queens, 3 Renaissance women, and the price of power.
Okay. Well, we're going to go to another type of royalty. Back in the American South, our king, Elvis.
Nice.
So this book, From Here to the Great Unknown, is a memoir written by Lisa Marie Presley through her daughter, Riley Keough. So this one, I believe, was just an Oprah pick like a month or two ago. But in 2022, Lisa Marie Presley, who is Elvis's daughter, asked her daughter, Riley, to finally help her write her long simmering memoir. So a month later, Lisa Marie was dead, and the world would never know her story in her own words. So Riley Keough, after a period of mourning, decided her mom had actually made these tapes.
Wow.
And I listened to the audiobook, and you actually hear part of these tapes as part of the audiobook production. Yeah, it is cool. So, and Riley does her portion of the memoir, which is like her reflection on her mother's life. And then they have Julia Roberts actually doing the part of Lisa Marie Presley.
Oh.
So it's very well done, having these 3 different voices. You really get engaged in it. So after listening to this, the first part of the story was probably the most enjoyable for me. One thing you really realize is that famous people don't have, their lives are just dysfunction with a capital D. So many issues. And it's just the tragedy, and you wonder sometimes, is it genetic or can you inherit trauma?
Yeah, generational trauma.
Yeah.
Especially if you're coming from a Presley
Yes. So,
prestige. Yeah.
It was really interesting to read about Graceland and see how Elvis brought all his family and his relatives and all these people, all these hangers-on were there. And he was also kind of affiliated, which I didn't know, with the Memphis Mafia.
What? I did not know that either.
No, I didn't either. But I think a lot of people used him terribly. And of course, after the drug use, then it was easier to manipulate and use him.
He didn't know how to say no.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
And it killed him.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But
That's
his
sad.
daughter grew up as kind of she was like the princess of this domain. She got little golf carts, could ride around, go wherever she wanted, go into the rooms whenever she wanted. He pretty much indulged her. So when he died, and she was under 10, I can't remember actually how old she was now. She was devastated, absolutely heartbroken. It was kind of like having the fun dad, and she loved the atmosphere of Graceland and the family and all the surrounding families. So now she's got to go live in L.A. with her mother, Priscilla Presley, who was a totally different person. Very involved in Scientology. Again, I didn't know this. And oftentimes would find Lisa Marie uncontrollable and would just kind of give her over to the house at Scientology, they had rooms and suites and all. Of course, she's talking about not getting able to do anything, and yet she's going to all these parties and doing all these things that are really not appropriate I would think, for a young person, but this is how they
I
lived.
think that's part of it. I think young people in Hollywood are exposed to way too much too early.
Right.
And therefore, childhood is sort of bequeathed,
Yeah. Well,
And
they kind of miss a normal childhood.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
It's just given away.
Yeah.
And it's usually from people that have the same thing happen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And they just perpetuate the cycle.
That's all it is.
Yeah. And also, then you start running into, the paparazzi, always wanting
Oh, yeah.
pictures and moments of your life and anything special, and, having to give yourself over for news stories or this or that. So,
And
it
having
seems
as a young
hard.
kid, that seems really hard.
yeah.
It's also probably worth mentioning that Elvis had a twin that died at childbirth, and apparently he once he learned of that, he never really got over that.
Yeah. I would like to read more about Elvis,
Yeah.
after reading this book, because this was really written more from, his daughter's point of
Right,
view,
yeah.
not even like Priscilla's point of view, or, and Priscilla was very young when she married Elvis, and they had this child. I believe it was their only child together. So then you go on to the years of, Priscilla getting thrown out of schools and not Priscilla, but Lisa Marie getting thrown out of school and, starting relationships with people. The one thing that was always present in her life is Riley Keough's father, Danny Keough, who was a musician. Even though they divorced and everything, he was kind of always around,
That's good.
So like if she had a house, he would be in the guest house, even when she was married to somebody else.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
he definitely maintained a presence with his daughter. So there's always this grief in this family. And then, unfortunately, Lisa Marie also loses her son, Riley Keough's brother, to, I believe, he committed suicide. So I don't think she was ever the same after that. But there's definitely a bond between the mother and daughter. You really learn a lot about the price of fame. She does go into the whole, like, Michael Jackson thing, like how her mom married Michael Jackson for a while, and their
forgot
relation.
about that.
Oh, I know, I did too. So it was interesting. I will not say it is uplifting.
Is it for Elvis fans, you think, or is it going to be more for like completionists or?
I would say more for completionists
Yeah.
and for people that are just kind of interested in that lifestyle.
Yeah. Okay.
And for me, I'm not somebody that reads a lot of magazines or keeps up with celebrities, but I found it very interesting from that point of view, and also the fact that I don't think I'd ever want to be famous.
Well, not like that, at least. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought it was interesting, and it really wasn't that long. I think an audiobook wise, it was, and I run them a little bit faster, but it probably runs between 6 and 8 hours. So if you've got a long car trip, you could easily get through this. Yeah, but definitely worth reading. Like, I can't say I love it because I thought the subject matter was so hard and so sad.
Yeah.
Just to see all these generations of people that have had things go wrong or whatever. It's kind of amazing that Riley Keough is doing as well as she is. And the only thing I've ever seen her in was that production on Amazon, which was Daisy Jones and the Six.
Did she act in that?
Yeah, she would act and
Oh.
sang in that. She was like the lead person.
Oh, I guess I never put that together.
Yeah, that's
that was
her.
a good show.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. They did a lot of their own music, and she sings and
Man.
gave me very much Stevie Nicks vibes
Okay.
in
Nice.
that. So,
Does it end on an uplifting note or no?
no. I mean,
I'm trying.
I
here.
think she really wanted her mom's story told, and
Okay.
I think she did it. She got the
She
job
didn't
done.
Sugarcoat it, or she
No,
just
and
told
I
it like
think
it was.
yeah, and she did try to give like positive things that her mom did too. So it wasn't like all bad.
Good.
They went to Japan. I mean, they get to do like amazing things because
Mm-hmm.
you have this wealth.
It's wild because Lisa, she was born in like 67 or 68, and she's dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah. I don't think she lasted too much longer after her son.
Yeah, man.
And she didn't, according to Riley Keough, she really didn't have drug use in her own life until like later in her,
Okay.
was kind of always present in the fact that, oh, my father struggled with this, so I'm probably going to struggle with this. And then she started having some medical issues, and then sure enough, kind of manifested itself. So, yeah, so that's my modern memoir. What you got in the past for us?
Jumping back a few centuries, I'm going to talk about Margaret Cavendish in Pure Wit, The Revolutionary Life of Margaret Cavendish by Francesca Peacock. That just came out last year.
Okay.
So that was a very good purchase for whoever bought the nonfiction title that month. So she was first a countess, and then she was Duchess of Newcastle, and she wrote over 20 books between the 1650s and 1670s. And one of her most famous ones, which I did not know, was, and apparently everybody in the academic world has heard of this, is the proto-science fiction work, The Blazing World, about a voyage to the North Pole where the main character comes across human-like bears.
Oh, wow.
And in The Blazing World, she writes, "My ambition is not only to be empress, but authoress of a whole world." So Margaret seemed like a very complicated, complex figure. I actually listened to this audiobook twice because there was so much information to take in about her. Every time, like, I felt like I had a beat on her. Like, she would do something totally like about face, and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe like she's shy, but she's outspoken. She's outrageous, but she's withdrawn. And I'm just like, what are you? And that was apparently everybody's take on her. So diarists wrote about her, John Evelyn wrote about her, Samuel Pepys wrote about her. So we do have contemporary perspectives on her, and we have her own words in her writing. So she was seen as an eccentric. Some thought her insane. Somebody said that they've seen saner people in Bedlam.
So you said, though, she wrote 20 books.
She wrote 20 books.
Wow.
There's manuscripts of her writing in the Princeton Library. There's love poetry between her and her husband in the British Library. I do want to note that the author said several times that Margaret Cavendish's writing is erratic and her handwriting is atrocious. So I want to look this up. I want to see what this handwriting looks like. I want to see what is so bad that an academic will say it's hard to read.
Right, because I would think a lot of that writing is hard to read.
Especially for this time period, too. I have trouble reading it. But if you're, and she was not formally educated either.
Oh, and I was just about to ask that, because I would think that most women, even in royal or more affluent families, the women were not educated like the men.
So her take was, and I'm just talking extemporaneously here, so I hope I'm not getting anything wrong, but her take on it was she was not firmly educated. She was self-taught. Whatever she knew came from her husband and her husband's brother. So, but then other people took that and were like, your books are so incredible or so out there. They're like, how could you possibly have written this without a formal education? So they doubted her authorship too.
Oh, okay.
So I thought that was really interesting. So she was kind of put in a tricky position. Either you were not well educated and, you know, you didn't write this, or you were well educated and you're downplaying it. So she was later seen as kind of a mocking figure. Like, she was kind of made fun of in the academic world. People called her Mad Madge. Virginia Woolf did not do her any favors by really disparaging her in her writing. Virginia Woolf called her a cucumber in a rose garden. I have no idea, but apparently
What
it was
an insult.
It was a bad influence or bad insult there. So,
Frightened words.
yes, definitely.
You
It was the
cucumber,
old-
you, Sean.
it was the old glove cross face, I guess. But whatever Virginia Woolf said, I mean, it struck like the literature world so much that like academics would apologize for being interested in Margaret Cavendish for decades afterwards.
I see David Bowie's name down there.
I'm going to get there.
Okay.
So a lot of it, like I mentioned, comes from diarists who wrote about her. Samuel Pepys, who wrote many, many diaries, and I read a kind of snippet that I thought was interesting during the Great Fire of London in 1666. He's all like, my diaries, my diaries. He buries his diaries and his Parmesan cheese to save them in the fire.
What priorities?
I was like, yes, you go. That was awesome. John Evelyn's wife, Mary, wrote about Margaret Cavendish, saying that she hopes as an original she will never have a copy. And so there she was I'm struggling to describe her because she's so like complex and conflicting too. So she was shy, but she was a talkative philosopher. She liked to wear men's clothes, but she also liked to dress up in outrageous low-cut dresses. She covered her face in beauty spots, and these were like little velvet cutout shapes of stars and diamonds and crescent moons. And people would follow her everywhere, like she was David Bowie. And that's how they described her in the book, or like a Beatle, like she was one of the Beatles. That just hundreds of people would follow her, and they said that they followed her like the Queen of Sweden.
She was
at court.
probably a social media influencer before social media.
Yeah,
I think it's a
pragmatic.
very fair
Yeah.
take on it. So
Yeah.
she was a very prolific writer. She was born to a wealthy Colchester family in the 1620s, and her family was tainted by scandal. Her mother had an illegitimate child when she was 13, and then her father was actually abroad at the time when Margaret was born because he was exiled because he was in a duel. So she had a lot going on. She was the youngest of 8. And this was during the time of the English Civil War, where like the Royalists and Oliver Cromwell and all that. So there was a lot of conflict. Her home was besieged. Her mother's grave was despoiled.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so there was a lot of conflict and worrying in her life. So Margaret, after her father dies, Margaret ends up going to live with some of her older siblings who are married. And then when the revolution, or when the Civil War breaks out in the 1640s, she kind of decides London is not the place to be as a royalist. So she travels with her brother to Henrietta Maria's court, and she goes into exile with Charles I's queen, Henrietta Maria. So Henrietta Maria, who was the youngest daughter of Henry IV, who I talked about with Catherine de Medici. So it's all connected in there. Everybody's all related. So Margaret Cavendish, when she was Margaret Lucas, she went to live at the court in Paris. And then while she was away, her mother, her sister, and her brother died. And they described life at court as tedious and dull. Being in the presence, you did a lot of sitting and standing and waiting to amuse the queen. And there was a paragraph about making sure that the maids of honor used the right bathroom at court. Even when they were in exile, even when they were like in some abbey or some corner of a house, it was still like, there's the presence chamber. This is the bathroom you can use. It just never changed. It just got smaller. So there were times of military action too. They were besieged at Oxford, and I found it very interesting how they talked about Queen Henrietta Maria as being this active military figure. In other books that I've read about her, I mean, she was involved in the English Civil War, but the takes that I got from other books were very different, that she kind of pushed Charles I into it by making him go after the Parliament, saying, go you coward, because they were going to arrest her for treason. And she sent him off, said, go you coward, or don't look at me anymore. And when he goes to arrest these members of Parliament that were threatening his wife, they were gone. And that kind of triggers, he overstepped, and he gets imprisoned, and he eventually gets executed. So Henrietta Maria, whether she was a strong military figure, whether she was the cause of all this, whether she was a positive or negative influence on the war, this book makes her out to be some kind, they called her a generalissimo, and I'm like, I don't know about that. So, but there was military action. They talked about other women who were involved in the English Civil War, who were put in positions where they had to defend their homes. There was the Countess of Derby, who got so enraged at being besieged by the parliamentarians, she threatened to burn it all down rather than let them have it. And then she was rescued by Charles I's nephew, Prince Rupert. So while the court is in exile in France, William Cavendish pulls up in his coach pulled by 9 horses, and he just wows everybody. And he was the grandson of Bess of Hardwicke, who built Chatsworth Hall. And William was about 30 years older than Margaret. Very scandalous.
Gosh.
Yes.
Well, not so scandal. I mean, it seems pretty common in those times.
It was enough that people talked and tried to talk her out of it. So, 30 years older than Margaret. And it was not an arranged marriage. So maybe that was why it was so scandalous, because it was not, we're marrying you for your connection, your title, your money.
Well, it doesn't sound like she came from the type of family that they would have been looking for.
No.
Oh, look at you with your mom with her illegitimate,
Yes, no, very scandalous, but they
Yeah.
were wealthy, but they lost it during the English Civil War.
Okay.
When everything got, when their home got overtaken and, they took all the property. So William rolls up and wows everybody. He's broke and living in exile on credit. So he's got nothing. She's got nothing. She was hesitant over the match. Her friends are trying to talk her out of it, saying he's a player. And I wrote down what they said. It was so good. So her friends are telling her that William was assured to many and constant to none. She was kind of like, oh, he's a lot older. And William's he wrote her over 70 love poems.
Oh.
And one of them, he talks about how old and dry wood makes the best fire.
Oh, great.
His wife had just passed away.
Use that at the bar next time you're out.
Yeah. I think I'll leave that one to you, Sean.
I was like, really? He said that? Wow.
What a cad.
People don't change, do they? Doesn't matter what century we're in.
They get a little racier too, but I'm going to leave that off of book break.
Sure.
William's first wife, Elizabeth Bassett, had just died a couple years before, and he'd had 10 children with Elizabeth, so 10 seems to be the magic number.
Oh, great. So you can be a stepmom to 10 children, too. Wow, what a draw that is.
5 lived to adulthood.
Yeah.
2 of them were sons. When Margaret married William, she was younger than William's eldest daughter.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
But William was in exile. He wasn't with his family, so she didn't have to deal with any stepchildren because they weren't living with William.
Oh, gosh.
So there was that. Love poems in the British Library. So William is wooing Margaret with his, studly love poems, and she has complicated beliefs on marriage. She sees it as a system of obligation and servitude.
Well, that was pretty true.
So it was kind of surprising when she went and got married
Yeah.
to a much older man, and
Did he have money?
No, he was broken in
Oh, wow.
exile.
Okay.
Yeah. He was, at the time, I think he was Earl of Newcastle, so he wasn't even a duke. And they weren't really honoring the titles during the English Civil War, too, because they were just like rolling everything back. So he's got no property. He's living on credit. He's having to constantly charm creditors to get like money to pay for all these like showy coaches and 9 horses that he really can't afford. So they had to get permission from the Queen to marry because he was a favorite general, but he was disgraced at the Battle of Marston Moor. He did something very, very bad and shameful, and he didn't have a great military career. And then she was a maid of honor, and Henrietta Maria really didn't like to let those people go because they made her court look fancy and big and still legitimate. So William and Margaret marry in 1645, and they're so poor, William tries to get Margaret to sell her clothes so they can buy dinner,
Good Lord.
and she would not do it. She found something else to sell, and I'm dying. I'm like, what did you sell? His baseball cards? Like, what did you have? So he wanted her to sell her clothes, and she's like, no, anything but that. So she went back to England with William's brother, Charles. William couldn't go back because he was under threat of death if he returned. She was a woman, so she was safer from that. So they go back to London to try to beg Parliament for some of William's estate to live on. And they're unsuccessful. She starts writing for money, which was very unusual to get paid during that time. So women would write and circulate handwritten copies as a way to both preserve their chastity and their modesty and also circumvent the censorship system. So there was an example mentioned that just a few years earlier, a printer had had his right hand removed for saying that the monarch was too old to have children. So you're having to deal with that kind
Tough
of
times.
censorship. Yup. So, but that was under Queen Elizabeth I's reign, and now we're in Charles I's reign. But, publishing your work as a named female author was very much against the social norms there.
That's wild.
Yeah, so most of the work that was coming out was written by Quaker women. They were religious writings or they were aristocratic books. And I desperately want to see some of these aristocratic books. I guess they've got to be like Pinterest, like how to raise your kid on, here's your diamond rattle or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, make sure the nurse eats good food or whatever. So Margaret's trying to write for money. Her writing is haphazard and disordered, but she's making money on it. And she's writing about all kinds of things. She writes plays that she doesn't ever mean to be performed, but they are. She writes books on science and atoms. She knows Thomas Hobbes and Ben Jonson, and she's just like right in this literary circle.
So was she living with her husband, or is he still back in?
He's still back in Amsterdam or
yeah.
Paris or wherever. She's with her brother-in-law in London.
Now, who thinks that this is on the up and up?
It gets a little bit risque. So when she's printing, she's getting mad too because she said, I love this quote. She said that it is against nature for a woman to spell right, and she is incensed when the printers don't copy edit her work, and when they print it as is, and they leave everything in there. And she calls the printers a bad midwife for not fixing her mistakes and for making her look bad. But it is her own work. So, and I'm like, you can't have it both ways. But she
Well,
tries.
everybody needs an editor.
Yeah.
Yes. And they were not having anything of it. So she was not happy that the printers printed her work as is. It was very scandalous. She skirted controversial beliefs, atheism. She talked about,
I think I would like this lady.
she seems wild. I got a little fuzzy and lost when they started talking about vital materialism theory and how atoms moved. And I was like, oh gosh.
Oh, she must have been against Aristotle's teachings then. Yeah.
Yeah. And what made up the universe.
This makes sense now.
So she was, yes. So she was, and then I don't know if she got along with Descartes or not, but I think there was an incident where they were at dinner together and she didn't understand him because she didn't speak French. So, but they're at the same table. So Margaret does not get any money back from Parliament. Charles is sick, so he stays in England. Margaret comes back from England, and William writes a ton of jealous poetry to her. So there is some kind of implication that she was unfaithful to him. He talks about how her heart is cold and made of marble. When she was gone, he dreamed about her, and he kissed his pillow, and he missed her so much. And she was just this cold-hearted woman and lots and lots of jealous poetry. So
How long were they separated for?
about 15 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're back together, and wherever the court is in exile, the restoration happens. Charles II comes to the throne, and William and Margaret come back to England, and they want to recoup some of this money William's lost. And Margaret wrote a biography about her husband in the 1670s and said that she estimated that they lost almost £1 million supporting the royalist cause. And she wants that money back. She does not get a lot of the money back. They kind of try for a position at court. I think William becomes a tutor at some point to one of the royal children, but eventually they give up and they go to Nottinghamshire and they just live in retirement there. Margaret dies 3 years before William does. William is totally surprised, did not expect his wife.
Yeah, because he's 30 years older.
Yes. And she didn't have any children, so there wasn't the childbirth risk factor
Oh,
either.
okay, which was
So
a huge mortality risk at that time.
it really was. So she called her books her babies, and she said that that's why she wrote so much, because she didn't have children to occupy her time.
Okay.
So William gets it together and spends over £100 to bury her in Westminster Abbey.
Oh, wow, so she's there.
She's there. And I looked up for comparison, and around that time period, like Samuel Pepys, I think, buried his brother for like £11.
So you had to pay a lot to get her in there.
So she went out with a bang, and she's at
Okay.
Westminster Abbey. So that is Margaret Cavendish.
Wow. All right, so I'm going to go into another direction again. And I am going to talk about, it's called I Am, 17 Brushes with Death, a memoir by Maggie O'Farrell. And I have read fictional books by Maggie O'Farrell. She wrote one called The Wedding Portrait, which was excellent. She also wrote Hamnet, which was about
yes.
Shakespeare's son. And this one is one of the most unusual kind of memoirs that I've read, in that she's taking these life-altering incidents in her life to tell her own story. Like, she tells about the incident, but then she reflects back to other things. So the first story, I have to read you how this book starts, and then you'll know why I just stayed up and finished this thing all in a day. And each chapter is kind of written in a part that was affected. So the first one is called The Neck in 1990. On the path ahead, stepping out from behind a boulder, a man appears. We are, he and I, on the far side of a dark tarn that lies hidden in the bowl-curved summit of this mountain. The sky is a milky blue above us. No vegetation grows this far up, so it is just me and him. The stones and the still black water. He straddles the narrow track and with both booted feet, and he smiles. I realize several things. That I passed him earlier, further down the glen. We greeted each other in the amiable yet brief manner of those on a country walk. That on this remote stretch of path, there is no one near enough to hear me call. That he has been waiting for me. He has planned this whole thing, carefully, meticulously, and I have walked into his trap. I see all this in an instant. So that's...
What happens, Claire?
Oh, well, obviously she lives because she writes the book. But yeah, it's a scary...
What a hook.
Yeah, exactly. What a hook. And all of her stories are not quite like that one made one of the most impressions on me because I think as a woman, and since this is Women's History Month, is so many women, like from a young age, we're taught, don't go to the parking garage by yourself at night. Don't do this. Don't do that. And, hiking by yourself. And that really hit hard with me because I do a lot of hiking, walking in the woods and such. But it's kind of like your biggest fear. Yeah, so that hooked me right away. And although nothing happened to her, she was able to get out of this situation. The next young woman was not so lucky. Oh, wow. So she was the police kind of blew her off when she came into the station to report the incident that she had with this gentleman, and then had to come calling a week later and ask her questions again when someone was found dead. So, yeah, it was a very powerful story. So chilling. The other stories she had, when she was young, had encephalitis.
Oh.
And
Do you have measles?
No, she just had some kind of inflammation of the brain. She was born, I believe, in Northern Ireland. And from that, she had balance issues. She actually couldn't walk. She was in a wheelchair in a while when she was young, kind of tormented, never could tell certain things like, am I up, am I down? And that plays into part, she struggled for so long, had to relearn to walk, relearn to do a lot of things. She gives you a story about how she got put into the the CAT scan machine, that tube when she was real young, which was terrifying. So she had this zest for life and almost what I would call a reckless fearlessness to kind of live life to the fullest. So she takes more risks than the normal person. So therefore, she is going to be in more positions where she's going to be in near-death experiences. She tried to tell a doctor when she was pregnant about different conditions that she had because of this thing. She was totally discounted. The people thought she was being hysterical. Oh, you don't need a C-section. That's just something that people want nowadays because they don't want to be bothered. And then she nearly bleeds to death. Just different things. And it was so riveting to read about this woman and things that happened to her when she was traveling, because she really just wanted to travel and see the world. She didn't want to stay in Ireland. Then I think they lived in Wales, and maybe England at certain times. She was applying to be an academic, didn't make the final level of exams in England in order to achieve that goal. So that started her traveling. She had some really horrible things happen to her there too, from stomach issues to a robbery and bugging, which was another Nick episode, and a machete. So yeah, it was a really interesting book. Oh, and also miscarriages,
What would
in
you say
between.
the tone of the book was?
The tone of the book, overall, it just was brutally honest, but yet insightful. I don't, and I think what she wants you to take away from it is, life is precious. And I think if we look back into all of our lives, we all have those moments where we go, whew, there, but for the grace of God,
Yeah,
we've all done
absolutely.
stupid things or could have had things go one way or another. And that's, I think, what she kind of portrays in here. It's like you have to really want to live life and have a zest for life. And, these are the choices, and here's what happens for when the path veers. So I thought it was really interesting. If you like the way she writes her fiction, I would definitely recommend this for you. And if you like memoirs, too. I just thought
So
it
that was
was
a one-day read.
Yeah, it was a one-day read for me.
Nice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, couldn't put it down. It's not that long. It's like 200 and some pages, but yeah, it's less than 300 pages, so, relatively short. So
Nice.
that was my last one.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to add that too to my list.
Yeah.
It sounds amazing. So the last one I'm going to talk about is The Husband Hunters, American Heiresses Who Married into the British Aristocracy by Anne de Courcy, and it came out in 2018. So this is very much along the lines of like Downton Abbey,
Oh, okay.
which I really wasn't as rabid a fan as like other people in my family were, but it was all right. But it was a little too modern for me. I like my Renaissance periods and I like my medieval history. But the author talks about there's about 400 American women who married into the American aristocracy between 1870s and the early 1900s.
Wow.
Yeah. So the author talks about a snapshot or just a brief selection of these women, because I was like 400. I was like, I'm never going to get through this book. This is how you keep them straight. I don't know. So she talks about a few of them, and she talks about, the socio-political ramifications of these marriages, with rich American women marrying poor British aristocracy.
Well, didn't somebody in Churchill's family?
She talks about Jenny Jerome.
Okay, yeah.
Who is Winston Churchill's
His
mother.
mom, yeah.
She talks about Consuelo Vanderbilt, who is Duchess of Marlborough. She was the daughter of Alva Belmont, who was very active in the women's suffrage movement.
Okay.
So Alva Belmont wanted to break into the social scene with Mrs. Astor's 400 and all that. And she was divorced. It was scandalous. So she wasn't going to make the cut until her daughter became a duchess. And then she had entree into it.
Wallace Warfield Simpson.
Yeah, just there. There is some overlap there. They do talk about Maud Emerald Burke, who was a good friend of Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson.
Okay.
And so they talked about how these American women affected English culture. Maud Burke popularized English opera. Nancy Astor became the first female member of Parliament in England. And but pretty much it was a lot of story after story of, the house was crumbling and falling down until this heiress came with all her millions, and, we could fix up Blenheim Palace. And,
Well, I think that was one of the reasons why they wanted the American women was the cash influx.
So
Yeah.
this would be like Meghan then, too, right?
No.
No.
This is like the generation of probably right around World War I,
Oh, okay.
because everything kind of started to fall apart, World War II?
It was before that. The Gilded Age started to decline in the early
Oh, I got
1900s.
it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So there was, I can't remember the name of the family, but there was one family who had I think it was the Bradley Martins, had this great big ostentatious party that just, everything looked like Versailles. And then after that, people were like, wow, that was a step too far. And there was a sociologist named Thorsten Verben who coined the term conspicuous consumption. Mm-hmm. And after that, they really scaled it back. But a lot of people were trying to break into the American aristocracy for social gain. And it became, this was during Queen Victoria's time, but her son was becoming more and more popular as Prince of Wales. And he was very much interested in having a good time. He liked his food, he liked his clothes, he liked his women. And if you could afford to entertain him, he would come to your party.
Is this Birdie?
Yep.
Okay.
It is. So, so he had a lot of American female friends,
Okay.
Including Jenny Jerome. And so that was happening in Britain. And then meanwhile, while this is happening, people in America are like, wait. they estimate like hundreds of millions of dollars went across to British estates to shore them up. But I kind of fell down a rabbit hole in there looking up like what happened to these houses. And there's one, Coombe Abbey, which is it was the home of the Earl of Craven. It's a hotel you can stay at in Warwickshire.
Oh,
Yeah, I looked at it. I was like, oh, that's fancy.
that
And
would be fun.
there's like Lady Craven's bedchamber and like all these
Well,
just
a lot
amazing
of these
suites.
places you can tour now.
Yes.
You know.
They had to open it to the public
Right.
to be self-sustaining.
Yeah.
For sure. I don't think any of the ones that they talked about are private homes anymore.
No.
But I am going to lastly just do a quick dive into one of the American heiresses they talked about, who is Princess Diana's great-grandmother.
Ah.
Who I did not know this. So Fanny Work married the Honorable James Boothby Burke Roche, and he was a serial philanderer and gambler. Her father continually bailed him out of his debts because you could owe the tailor, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and that was fine. They could wait for years. But if you owe a gentleman money from a card game, that was a debt of honor, and you better pay up. So her father keeps bailing out this guy, and he gets mad after he spends $100,000 in 1 year. And he tells Fanny he's going to stop pouring money down a rat hole. And he is cutting her off. No more $5,000 a month allowance. And, she's like, oh. She divorces her husband. She comes back to America with her daughters. He comes back with their sons. He wants to get money from his father-in-law. His father-in-law won't give him any money, so he leaves his sons with her too. And one of those twin sons grows up to be Princess Diana's grandfather.
Oh my gosh.
So,
Who knew? Who knew that we had an effect there?
all right. So it was very interesting. It was a bit like I had a hard time keeping everybody straight, all their stories.
Yeah.
I feel like I needed a chart or a graph or something. But overall, it was a pretty consistent theme. And it was interesting. It was entertaining.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people that watched Downton Abbey could kind of relate to it because you could see the story in a very fictionalized way played
Yes.
out on the
Oh,
screen.
absolutely. It
Yeah.
did. It did read very much like a soap opera.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was it for me.
Interesting. Well, hopefully we gave you some good picks for Women's History Month. It's actually a nice day, so enjoy your spring. Keep
Yes.
reading. Reminder that you have until March 31st to turn in your bingo boards for the Winter Reading Challenge, and we will see you in the springtime in April.
Book Break is a production of the Greece Public Library, made possible through the support of the Friends of the Greece Public Library. Theme music composed and performed by Sean Greif.